we parked our dented Volvo between a shining Tesla and a vintage Jaguar, a physical manifestation of the gap between my sister Brittany's world and mine. We hadn't even reached the steps before she descended, eyes scanning my children like a health inspector. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, she smoothed her silk dress. "Next time, dress them properly," my sister said, loud enough for guests to hear. My daughter's hands shook. "My husband looked at her once," said 6 words. Silence followed. The air on the terrace seemed to crystallize, freezing the laughter of 50 wealthy strangers. Leo didn't yell. He didn't even frown. He simply adjusted his cuff, a movement so precise it looked like a weapon being loaded. For 12 years, my husband had played the role of the quiet, amiable wallflower, absorbing Brittany's barbs to keep the peace for my sake. But looking at Lily's trembling chin, something in his posture shifted. The sleeping giant had finally woken up. Just moments before, we had been herded past the velvet ropes like cattle. Brittany had directed the coordinator to seat us in the overflow area, a dark corner adjacent to the heavy, swinging kitchen doors. The smell of industrial dish soap mingled with expensive perfume. We were the poor relations, the necessary charity cases invited only to make the hostess look benevolent by comparison. I had accepted the humiliation, keeping my head down. But Brittany just couldn't leave well enough alone. Lily had only wanted to use the restroom. She had returned with red, rimmed eyes, clutching the soft skirt of the Ralph Lauren dress I had found at an estate sale. It was beautiful, but to Brittany it was just old. She had intercepted my 9-year-old near the raw bar, pointing out the scuffs on her shoes to a circle of bridesmaids. That casual cruelty was the spark. Brittany didn't just want us invisible, she wanted us to feel small. Now, Brittany stood there, smiling that practiced, camera-ready smile waiting for us to apologize for our existence. She swirled her vintage Dom P.A. Rignan, confident in her dominion over this rented kingdom. She expected Leo to shuffle his feet and mutter a sorry. She expected me to hush the children and drag them away to hide our shame. She had built her entire self-worth on being the successful sister, the one who married well and lived in a sprawling golden mansion. But Leo didn't shuffle. He stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder before turning his gaze to my sister. The temperature on the terrace seemed to drop 10 degrees. Guests lowered their glasses, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. Leo reached into his pocket, not for a handkerchief, but for his phone. He tapped the screen once, his blue eyes cold and devoid of their usual warmth. The party was over, even if nobody else knew it yet. Leo's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient jazz like a serrated knife. He looked directly at Brittany, his expression unreadable, and delivered the sentence that would dismantle her life. "I am not renewing your lease." The words hung there, simple and devastating. He didn't stutter. He didn't blink. For a second, the only sound was the fountain splashing in the background. Brittany's smile froze, the corners of her mouth twitching as her brain tried to process the impossible statement. Then came the laugh, high-pitched and brittle, like glass breaking on a stone floor. Brittany tossed her head back, performing for her audience of bewildered socialites. "Oh, Leo," she trilled, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "You have such a dry sense of humor." Always joking. She looked around the circle, desperate for validation, silently begging them to join in. A few people chuckled nervously, but most just stared. They sensed what I already knew deep in my gut. This wasn't a joke. Leo didn't smile back. He didn't even acknowledge her desperate attempt to save face. Instead, he took a slow step forward, invading her personal space with a calm that was terrifying to witness. He tapped his phone screen again, bringing up a document that glowed bright white in the twilight. "This isn't a joke, Brittany," he said softly. "The lease agreement expires next month. Consider this your verbal notice from the property owner." The silence returned, heavier this time, suffocating the entire terrace. The guests were no longer pretending to ignore us. Conversations about stocks and summer homes died instantly. All eyes were fixed on the man in the worn blazer who had just threatened to evict the hostess of the year. I saw a woman in emerald silk whisper something to her husband, her eyes wide with scandalous delight. They were sharks smelling blood, and for the first time in her life, Brittany wasn't the shark. She was just the bait. Panic flared in my sister's eyes, quickly replaced by indignation. She straightened her spine, trying to regain the inches she had lost. "This is my house," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "You can't just come here and say things like that. I want you to leave." Now, she scanned the perimeter for the hired security, her hand raising to signal them. She was trying to exert power she didn't have, grasping at straws while the water rose around her. Leo didn't look at the approaching security guard. He kept his eyes locked on Brittany. "Actually, Clause 14, Section B," he recited from memory, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "The landlord reserves the right to inspect the property at any time during an event." He turned the phone around, shoving the screen toward her face. "You signed it 3 years ago, Brittany. Remember. Or did you not read the contract because you were too busy planning the decor?" Brittany stared at the glowing screen. I watched the color drain from her face, leaving her pale beneath her expensive bronzer. She recognized the logo at the top of the PDF. It wasn't just a standard lease. It was a document from a holding company she thought was a faceless corporation. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Leo slid the phone back into his pocket. "Now," he said, "let's talk about the rent you haven't been paying." Leo held the phone up, screen bright against the dimming light. He tapped a section, expanding the text until the bold header was visible to the people standing behind Brittany. "Let's read the addendum," he said. Section 4. Family Charity Adjustment. The words sucked the oxygen out of the air. Brittany blinked, her false eyelashes fluttering in panic. She tried to snatch the phone, but Leo moved it just out of reach. He began to read aloud, enunciating every syllable. "Tenant shall pay a fixed rate of $2,800. Leo read, glancing at the crowd. "Market value assessment, $4,200. The math hung in the air, a simple equation of humiliation. I calculated it in my head, my stomach dropping. $1,400 every single month. For 3 years. The silence from the guests deepened. They weren't just listening now, they were judging. The illusion of Brittany's self-made empire was crumbling brick by brick, exposing the rot underneath. I stared at my husband. This was years of silent subsidy, money he had quietly diverted to keep my sister afloat. He never mentioned it. Not when we drove our old Volvo, and not when I shopped at thrift stores for Lily's clothes. He had let Brittany play the queen while he footed the bill. The realization hit me harder than any insult. He had protected her fragile pride at the expense of his own dignity. Waiting for a gratitude that never came. Brittany's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. She looked toward her fiancé, Reed, but he was staring at his shoes. "I manage this estate," she shrieked, her voice cracking. That discount is for property management services. I take care of the grounds. It's a business arrangement. She was flailing, throwing words like sandbags against a flood. She turned to the woman in the emerald dress, eyes pleading. You know how much work I put into this place, Susan. You know? Leo shook his head. A gesture of pity. He scrolled to the signature line. Actually, the contract lists you as a tenant at will, Brittany. There is no management clause. The landscaping is paid for by the holding company. I signed those checks myself last week. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. You don't manage anything. You just live here. The distinction was brutal. It stripped away her last shred of professional dignity, leaving her just a squatter in designer heels. A low whistle cut through the tension. It came from a man leaning against a stone pillar, holding a tumbler of scotch. I recognized him. A prominent real estate developer. 4,200 is a steal for this acreage, he said, his voice carrying easily. I'd list it for $6,000 minimum. You've been getting a hell of a deal, darling. It was the final nail in the coffin. A stranger had just validated Leo's math. The crowd murmured their agreement. Brittany shrank back, her physical presence diminishing as the truth expanded. The narrative she had spun of the wealthy, benevolent older sister dissolved into mist. She looked at Lily's shoes, then at her own Manolo Blahniks, and I saw the calculation happening in her eyes. She realized everyone now knew exactly who paid for those shoes. Leo took a step back, gathering us in with his gaze. But it's not just the rent, he said. Let's talk about where the rest of the money went. Leo turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. He pointed a finger at Brittany's shimmering gold gown, the one she had twirled in earlier while mocking my daughter's dress. You talk about refined standards, he said, his tone clinical and detached. But let's be clear about how you afford them. That dress cost 2 months of the rent you didn't pay. Brittany clamped a hand over the silk bodice. The sequins caught the light, suddenly looking cheap. My wife shops at thrift stores. Leo continued, his gaze drifting to my faded blouse with a softness that made my throat tight. She drives a car with a dented bumper, so you could have this. He gestured to the catering spread, the towers of imported shrimp and artisan cheese. Every time you mocked my children for their clothes, you were doing it with money we effectively gave you. I felt a flush of heat. It wasn't just money. It was our life. Reed finally found his spine, stepping between Leo and Brittany like a threatened bird puffing its chest. Now wait a minute, he stammered, adjusting his silk tie with a trembling hand. We pay our own way in this town. I lease the Rover. I pay the club dues. He looked around for support, but the guests were silent, their faces unreadable masks. Reed was trying to salvage his manhood in front of the country club set, unaware he was standing on a trapdoor. Leo pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the movement sharp and decisive. He pulled a corporate fleet agreement from the folder. The Range Rover. Leo asked, raising a skeptical eyebrow. The lease is under the holding company's fleet account to lower your insurance premiums. Reed's jaw went slack. I pay the monthly fee, he whispered, but the conviction was gone. Leo nodded slowly. You pay the base rate. We cover the insurance and luxury tax. You are driving a corporate perk. Reed. Not an asset. Brittany let out a sob, a jagged sound that tore through the heavy tension. She looked at the guests, but their faces held only pity now, not the admiration she craved. The quality. she preached about, the right wines, the right schools, was revealed as a hollow facade. She wasn't an arbiter of taste, just a dependent. I just wanted everything to be nice, she whimpered, wiping mascara from her cheek. I wanted to show everyone we made it. Her vulnerability was repulsive, not sympathetic. Leo stepped closer, lowering his voice so only the immediate circle could hear the indictment. We froze the rent 3 years ago for a reason, Brittany. It was to help you save for a down payment on a starter home. He looked at the extravagant floral arrangements and the open bar. We wanted to help you build a future. Instead, you spent 3 years burning our money to impress people who don't even like you. The tragedy of the waste hung heavy in the air. Brittany looked up at the balcony where her friends stood, seeking an ally. She didn't see envy in their eyes anymore. She saw the same look people gave a stray dog, a mix of curiosity and aversion. She had spent the evening trying to prove she was better than us. But Leo had just proven she was destitute. The silence stretched, broken only by ice clinking in a glass. Leo turned to Lily, crouching down to her eye level. But money isn't the point. Leo ignored the murmuring crowd and brushed a stray hair from Lily's tear-stained cheek. His focus narrowed until the only thing that mattered was our daughter. Your shoes are perfect, he told her, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Do you know why? Because they walked you here to support family. That is what matters. He tied her shoelace, which had come undone during the commotion, pulling the knot tight. It was a fatherly act that made Brittany's posturing look even more grotesque. He stood up, towering over my sister once more. You think class is about labels and zip codes, Leo said, gesturing to the silent guests, holding their crystal flutes. You think it's about making sure everyone sees how much you spent. He took a step closer to her, and she flinched. Real wealth is quiet, Brittany. It's having the power to protect your people without needing an audience. It's about dignity. His words hit her like physical blows, stripping away her remaining defenses. The crowd began to shift, a subtle physical recoil that was devastating to watch. The women in designer gowns took small steps backward, creating a widening circle of isolation around my sister and Reed. They didn't want to be associated with the fraud anymore. The magic trick was over, and the wires were visible. Brittany looked at her friends, but they suddenly found their manicures fascinating. She had invited them to witness her triumph, but they were staying for her execution. Desperation clawed at Brittany's face. She turned to me, her eyes wide and wet, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Nicole, please, she hissed, reaching out a hand that trembled. I didn't mean it like that. I was just stressed. You know how important this night is for Reed's career. Can't we just fix this? She was trying to pull me back into our old dynamic, where she abused me and I smoothed it over. The old Nicole would have folded. I looked at her outstretched hand, manicured to perfection, and felt absolutely nothing. The frantic need for her approval that had dogged me for decades simply evaporated. You made my daughter cry over shoes. Brittany, I said, my voice steady and cold. You sat us by the kitchen so we wouldn't ruin your aesthetic. I stepped back, putting Leo between us. There is no fixing this. You broke the only thing that actually made you rich, my loyalty. Brittany's face hardened as the rejection sank in. Her sorrow instantly curdled back into spite, the mask slipping completely. Fine, she spat, straightening her spine in a mockery of dignity. If you want to be petty, then go. Take your husband and your brat and get off my property. She stomped her foot, a petulant child in a coucher gown. I don't need you! I don't need anyone! She was screaming now, confirming everything Leo had just said about character. Leo didn't flinch at her outburst. He watched her tantrum with the clinical detachment of a surgeon observing a patient. Actually, he said, cutting through her screeching with terrifying calm, we need to clear up one last administrative detail before we leave. He reached into his jacket pocket again, retrieving a sleek, folded envelope I hadn't noticed before. Since you brought up property rights. The atmosphere shifted from emotional tragedy to legal finality. He held the envelope like a blade. Leo pulled the heavy envelope from his inner pocket. He didn't hand it to Brittany. He held it like a sacred text, his thumb tracing the embossed seal on the corner. The guests craned their necks to see the official markings of the law. Brittany stood frozen, her chest heaving as the rage began to turn into cold, sharp dread. She realized her tantrum had changed nothing. The man she had mocked was still holding every card in the deck. I am officially exercising the non-renewal clause, Leo stated, his voice ringing across the marble foyer. The silence was absolute. Even the catering staff stopped moving to listen. He tapped the paper against his palm with a rhythmic, steady thud. This isn't a suggestion or a request for negotiation. It is a legal fact. He looked at the ornate chandelier above him, then back at Brittany. You have 30 days. Not 31. The locks change on the morning of the 31st day. Brittany's knees buckled slightly, her hand catching the edge of a mahogany table to stay upright. The gold champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stone floor. No one moved to help her. No one offered a napkin for the spill. The liquid spread toward her designer, heels like a rising tide. 30 days, she whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden, pathetic fragility. But the social season has just started. I have 3 more events planned for this lawn. You should have considered that before you insulted my children, Leo replied. His lack of anger was more terrifying than a shout. He looked at Reed, who was staring at the floor in total defeat. Your fiancé knows how this works? Brittany, he understands that a contract is a boundary. He finally extended the envelope. She wouldn't take it, so he simply set it on the table beside the broken glass. It was a physical anchor in her sinking reality. Leo turned his back on them, dismissing my sister from his world entirely. He reached for my hand, and I felt the solid, grounding heat of his palm against mine. We're done here, he said softly. I nodded, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. For years, Brittany had been a heavy weight I carried out of obligation. Now, I felt like I was floating. We didn't need to stay for the fallout. The fire was already burning behind us. The guests began to part as we walked toward the exit. They moved with a synchronized, respectful silence, creating a wide aisle for our family. I saw Susan, the woman in the emerald dress, look away in shame as we passed. They all knew they had participated in the mockery by remaining silent. Now, they were witnesses to the consequence. We walked past the VIP section, past the towers of cold shrimp, and headed toward the grand front entrance. Just as we reached the heavy oak doors, Brittany's voice rang out one last time. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a desperate, high-pitched plea. Wait, Leo! We can pay more! We'll match the market rate? She was running toward us, her silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet hall. She looked frantic, her makeup smeared into dark streaks. Just don't do this. Not now. Think of our reputation. She reached out for him. But Leo didn't even slow down his pace. Leo paused with his hand on the brass door handle. He didn't turn around to face her. "You missed the point, Brittany," he said over his shoulder. "It was never about the money. I would have let you live here for free forever if you had been kind." He opened the door, letting in the cool, honest night air of the Connecticut countryside. But kindness isn't something you can buy with a subsidy. He stepped out onto the gravel, leading us away. A shadow moved near the driveway. I realized it was the security guard Brittany had summoned earlier to throw us out. He stood by our old Volvo, his arms crossed over his chest. For a second, I worried there would be one last confrontation. But as we approached, he simply stepped aside. He nodded once to Leo, a gesture of quiet recognition between men who understood real power. He didn't look back at the mansion. He watched us as we loaded our children into the car. We settled into the worn fabric seats of our wagon. The engine groaned to life, a familiar and comforting sound after the artificial silence of the house. As we pulled away, I glanced at the side mirror. Brittany was standing on the porch, a small, golden figure framed by the massive white columns. She looked like a doll in a house that was no longer hers. Leo shifted into gear, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. We were finally heading home. The tires crunched on the gravel as we rolled toward the wrought iron gates. Behind us, the mansion blazed with light, a hollow diamond in the Connecticut woods. Inside the car, the silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. I watched Leo's silhouette against the passing street lamps. His hands were steady on the steering wheel. He looked like the same man I had married. Yet everything had changed. My husband was a stranger with a signature that could move mountains. I waited for the weight to drop. Lily leaned against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She was quiet, her small fingers tracing the scuffs on her shoes. I reached back and squeezed her knee, feeling the tension in her tiny frame. "You okay, baby?" I whispered. She nodded slowly, but her eyes remained fixed on the receding gates. She had seen her father dismantle a kingdom to protect her honor. It was a lesson in power that most children never get to witness. The world felt different now. The gates swung open automatically, recognizing our vehicle's transponder. It was a final irony. The very system that kept Brittany's world exclusive was programmed to obey us. Leo didn't look back as we cleared the perimeter. He accelerated onto the main road, the engine of our old Volvo humming with a reliability that felt symbolic. We were leaving the theater of lies behind. But as the first mile marker passed, I saw Leo's jaw tighten. He was checking the rearview mirror with a focused intensity. "Leo," I asked, my voice barely audible over the heater. He didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the mirror, his eyes darting between the road and the reflection. Following us were two beams of light, bright and aggressive. Someone was speeding to catch up. For a second, I thought it was Brittany, coming to beg or scream one last time. But the car behind us was larger, a dark SUV with a heavy grille. It swerved dangerously close to our bumper, flashing its high beams. Leo didn't panic. He shifted gears, his movements fluid and practiced. "Nicole, make sure the kids have their belts tight," he said calmly. I checked Jude and Lily, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The SUV pulled alongside us on the narrow, two-lane road. The window rolled down, revealing Reed's frantic face. He was shouting something, his features distorted by rage and desperation. He steered his Range Rover toward our lane, trying to force us onto the soft, muddy shoulder. "Stop the car," Reed screamed, his voice muffled by the wind. He was erratic, clearly pushed past his breaking point by the humiliation on the terrace. He didn't care about the safety of the children anymore. He only cared about the piece of paper Leo had left on the table. Leo didn't touch the brakes. He maintained a steady speed, his gaze fixed forward. "He's going to hit us," I gasped, clutching the dashboard. The luxury SUV swerved again, the metal nearly touching our door. Suddenly, Leo turned the wheel with a sharp, calculated jerk. I braced for impact, but it never came. Instead of fleeing, Leo had positioned our car in a way that blocked Reed's path to the next turnoff. He tapped the brakes just enough to let the SUV overshoot us. Reed overcorrected, his tires screaming as they lost grip on the wet asphalt. The Range Rover slid sideways, spinning in a graceful, terrifying arc before coming to a halt in a cloud of white smoke. Leo pulled over a few yards ahead. He sat there for a moment, the engine idling. "Stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stepped out into the night, his tall frame silhouetted by our taillights. I watched through the rear window as he walked toward the smoking SUV. Reed stumbled out of the driver's side, his expensive suit rumpled. He looked small and broken in the glare of the headlights. The two men stood in the middle of the road. Reed was sobbing now, his hands covering his face. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was a man realizing that his entire life was a house of cards that had finally collapsed. I couldn't hear what Leo was saying, but his posture wasn't aggressive. He stood with his hands in his pockets, listening to my brother-in-law's breakdown. The power dynamic had shifted again. It wasn't about leases or corporate fleet accounts now. It was about a man who had lost his soul to a lifestyle he couldn't afford. Leo returned to the car a few minutes later. He looked tired, the adrenaline finally fading from his system. He didn't say a word as he climbed back in and buckled up. He put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving Reed standing alone by his stalled vehicle. "What did he want?" I asked softly. Leo exhaled, a long, wary sound that echoed in the cabin. "He wanted to know if I was serious," Leo replied. I told him the clock was already ticking. The highway stretched ahead, a black ribbon cutting through the silent woods. I watched the green glow of the dashboard clock. It was nearly midnight. Lily and Jude had finally fallen asleep, their heads leaning against each other in the back seat. The tension that had coiled in my chest for years began to loosen. I looked at Leo, seeing the man who had hidden his strength to keep my pride intact. We were moving toward a future built on truth. "Why didn't you tell me about the company?" I asked, my voice a soft rasp. Leo kept his eyes on the road. His grip relaxed on the steering wheel. He sighed, a sound of heavy relief. "I wanted us to have a life that was ours, Nicole, not one defined by a balance sheet or your sister's envy." He was right. We had built a home on solid ground while Brittany had built hers on shifting sand. We were finally free. We stopped at a lonely diner on the Vermont border. The neon sign hummed, casting a blue light over the empty parking lot. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup. We sat in a cracked vinyl booth, the children blinking awake in the warmth. Leo ordered 4 bacon cheeseburgers with extra fries. No caviar, no foam, no judgmental eyes. Lily smiled, her earlier tears forgotten as she reached for a bottle of ketchup. It was the best meal. I realized then that the lie was dead. I had believed that fitting in with Brittany's world was the only way to be happy. I thought our discount life was a failure I had to hide. But watching Leo laugh with Jude, I saw the truth. We weren't the help. We weren't the poor relations. We were the foundation that had allowed her to play pretend. My sister had the house, but I had the home. The shame was gone. Leo reached across the table, sliding a small, worn key toward me. It wasn't for the mansion or a luxury car. It was the key to the old farmhouse we had been eyeing for years. I closed on it yesterday, he whispered. In your name. My heart skipped a beat as I touched the cold metal. He had been planning our real life while Brittany was busy decorating a fake one. We finally had a place that belonged only to us. The sun began to peek over the mountains as we pulled into our driveway. The world felt fresh, washed clean by the night's chaos. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth. My daughter skipped toward the porch, her scuffed shoes clicking on the wood. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. As I followed her, my phone buzzed with a frantic text from Brittany. I deleted it without reading. The silence was perfect,